In October 2019, in Washington County, Iowa, 35-year-old Claire Mercer stood beside a
You need
flatbed
some help
trailer
with that, Claire?
loaded with
I've got it.
300
Just
old
keep
windows
laughing.
while two men from the county road crew laughed behind her. Claire was a quiet woman with weathered hands, brown work boots, faded denim overalls, and a canvas jacket that had belonged to her grandfather. She had inherited 118 acres, an aging farmhouse, a collapsed machine shed, and nearly $74,000 in farm debt. She had not inherited much else. The windows were different. Some were tall and narrow. Others were cracked. A few still carried faded green paint from houses that had been demolished decades earlier. There were wooden sash windows, steel-framed windows, storm windows, and panes so cloudy that Claire could barely see through them. To everyone else, they looked like garbage. To Claire, they looked like a wall. 300? The county contractor called from his pickup. Claire kept tightening a ratchet strap. You know those are going to cost more to fix than they're worth. She didn't answer. The contractor laughed. Then he drove away. Claire watched the dust settle across the gravel and looked at the windows again. Behind them stood the old Mercer farm. The apple trees her grandfather had planted in the 1970s were still alive, but barely. Their branches were thin. Their leaves yellowed early. Spring blossoms had become unreliable, and the farm's small roadside produce stand had earned less every year. The bank wanted a payment by December. Claire had 11 weeks. She walked toward the orchard. Halfway there, she noticed something strange. 3 honeybees were crawling across one of the broken window frames. Claire stopped. The windows weren't supposed to attract bees. She crouched beside the trailer. The bees disappeared beneath a warped wooden sash. Claire pulled it loose. Nothing. Only dust, old cobwebs, and a smell she couldn't identify. She frowned. Then she heard an engine. Her neighbor, Harold Vance, rolled into the driveway in a battered Ford pickup. Harold was 61, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and permanently skeptical of anything that wasn't done the way his father had done it. He looked at the trailer, then at Claire, then back at the trailer. Tell me you didn't pay for those. Claire shook her head. They were free. That makes them worth exactly what you paid. She almost smiled. Harold climbed down. He had known Claire's grandfather. He had repaired the farm's irrigation pump twice and helped pull the old Farm-O-Lem from a flooded ditch in 1984. He walked toward the windows. What's the plan? Greenhouse. Harold stared at her. For 300 windows? Yes. You don't have greenhouse money. I know. You don't have heating money. I know. You don't have crop money. Claire looked toward the orchard. I know. Harold studied her face. You're planning something I don't understand. Claire picked up one of the old panes. My grandfather used to say this farm doesn't need more money first. Harold waited. What does it need? Claire looked through the cloudy glass. More growing days. Harold said nothing. That evening, Claire spread the windows across the barn floor. She measured every frame. 24 inches, 36, 48, somewhere nearly 6 feet tall. She wrote every measurement in a notebook. At midnight, she had a rough design. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't need to be. The greenhouse would sit on the south side of the barn, where the old orchard broke the wind. The windows would become walls and roof panels. The existing barn would serve as thermal mass on the northern side. But there was a problem. The windows weren't insulated, and Iowa winters were brutal. Claire went to bed knowing she had solved only the easiest part. The next morning, she called the County Agricultural Extension Office. A woman named Denise Parker arrived 2 days later. Denise was 48, practical, sharply dressed, and worked as an agricultural consultant for the county. She carried a clipboard, wore mud-resistant boots, and had the expression of someone accustomed to correcting farmers. She walked around the windows for nearly 5 minutes. Then she laughed. Not cruelly. Worse. Professionally. You're serious. Claire nodded. Denise pointed toward the pile. Single pane glass. Yes. Different sizes. Yes. Old wood. Yes. Some of these frames are rotten. I'll replace the bad sections. Denise looked at the barn. Claire, even if you build this, you can't expect it to pay your mortgage. Claire didn't argue. She opened her notebook. I don't need it to pay my mortgage. Denise raised an eyebrow. I need it to pay the farm. That answer changed the woman's expression. Denise looked again at the orchard. Then she noticed something Claire had not mentioned. Several apple trees near the southern edge had unusually thick clusters of green leaves. Most of the orchard had already begun turning yellow. Denise walked closer. She touched one leaf. Why is this section still growing? Claire looked at the trees. I don't know. They walked between the rows. The difference became obvious. Trees near the north side were stressed. Trees beside the barn were worse. But the southern edge remained surprisingly vigorous. Denise checked the soil, then the windbreak, then the slope. Finally, she looked toward an abandoned drainage ditch that ran behind the orchard. What's under here? Claire shook her head. My grandfather filled part of it. With what? I don't know. They found an old shovel in the barn. Claire started digging. 6 inches, then 12. At 18 inches, the shovel struck something hard. Metal. Claire scraped away the soil. A black iron pipe appeared beneath the roots. Denise crouched beside it. That shouldn't be here. Claire brushed dirt from the pipe. It ran directly toward the barn. Then the pipe disappeared beneath the foundation. Claire stood slowly. The windows suddenly seemed less important. Harold had once told her the farm used to have a spring house. Her grandfather had never talked about it. Claire looked at the buried pipe, then toward the 300 windows stacked beside the barn. Maybe the greenhouse wasn't the beginning. Maybe it was only the part everyone could see. That night, Claire returned to the orchard with a flashlight. At the southern edge, something beneath the ground was making a faint rushing sound. She stopped, listened, then she heard water. Claire did not sleep after hearing the water. At 4:17 in the morning, she was still sitting on the farmhouse steps, staring toward the orchard with a blanket around her shoulders. The sound had disappeared, but the pipe was still there. And if water had been moving beneath the orchard, Claire needed to know where it was going. At sunrise, she took the Farm-O-Lem out of the shed. The tractor was red beneath years of faded paint, its steering wheel polished smooth by 3 generations of hands. Her grandfather had bought it used in 1968, and Claire still remembered riding beside him on the narrow seat when she was a child. The engine coughed twice, then caught. Claire drove slowly toward the orchard. She had no intention of digging up the entire farm. Instead, she followed the buried pipe by looking for clues. The grass above one section was darker. Another patch stayed green even after several cold nights. She marked both with wooden stakes. Then she drove the farm toward the barn. That was when the tractor's rear wheel sank 6 inches. Claire stopped immediately. She climbed down. The ground looked firm. But beneath the tire, the soil was strangely soft. She scraped away the surface with her boot. A brick appeared. Then another. Claire knelt. Within 20 minutes, she had uncovered the top of a narrow brick channel. It ran directly beneath the old barn. Her grandfather had built something underground. But what? Claire called Harold. He arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a shovel. He stared at the brickwork. I've seen this before. Claire looked up. When? Your grandfather was always digging. That doesn't answer the question. Harold smiled faintly. He called it the cold line. Claire frowned. What was it? Harold shook his head. I never asked. You're telling me now? I thought it was something your grandfather made for storing potatoes. Claire stared at him. Under my barn? Harold shrugged. Your grandfather didn't explain things. That was true. Her grandfather had believed that machinery should be understood by taking it apart, and land should be understood by watching it for years. Claire dug another foot. The brick channel widened. Then they found a wooden cover. It had swollen shut. Harold wedged the shovel beneath it. The board broke. Cold air rose from below. Claire stepped backward. A narrow stone-lined passage disappeared beneath the barn, and somewhere inside it, water was moving. Harold looked at her. Don't go down there alone. Claire grabbed a flashlight. I won't. They climbed inside. The passage was barely wide enough for one person. Old limestone walls held the earth back. At the bottom, A shallow stream moved silently through a stone trough. The water was clear, ice cold. Claire followed it until the passage opened into a small underground chamber. There was an old concrete basin in the center. Beside it sat a rusted metal valve. Claire wiped away the dirt. Stamped into the valve was a date, 1974. Harold stared. Your grandfather built this after the drought. Claire looked at him. How do you know? Because I was here. He pointed toward the ceiling. There used to be a spring house above this. Claire remembered the stories. Her grandfather had mentioned losing the spring house in a flood, but he'd never said it had been replaced underground. Harold turned the valve. Nothing happened. He turned it again. The metal groaned, then stopped. Claire noticed another pipe leading upward. Where does that go? Harold followed it with his flashlight. Barn. They climbed back outside. The pipe entered the barn wall. Claire traced it across the old concrete floor. It disappeared beneath the place where she had planned to build the greenhouse. She stood still. The greenhouse suddenly had a water source. But there was still one problem. The bank. Claire had $2,140 in her operating account. Her greenhouse needed lumber, fasteners, soil, irrigation lines, heating equipment, and labor. She could not afford any of it. So she changed the plan. Instead of buying greenhouse benches, she built them from discarded oak boards. Instead of buying a new irrigation system, she cleaned the old underground line. Instead of installing electric heaters, she studied thermal storage. And instead of selling tomatoes like everyone else, she made a list. Leaf lettuce, spinach, microgreens, herbs, radishes, early strawberries, crops that could command premium prices during the months when Iowa fields were sleeping. Denise returned the following week. She walked into the barn and stopped. Claire had already repaired 47 window frames. The greenhouse skeleton was taking shape. Denise ran her hand along one of the old sashes. You actually built it. Claire nodded. Denise looked at the underground pipe. You found the old water system. Yes. Does it work? Claire opened the valve. Water rushed through the pipe. A moment later, it emerged into an old galvanized trough. Cold, clear, constant. Denise's expression changed. How much flow? Claire had measured it. 4 gallons a minute. Denise stared. That could matter. Claire nodded. But Denise wasn't looking at the water anymore. She was looking at the windows. Your biggest problem isn't heating. What is? Night. Claire knew what she meant. The greenhouse would absorb sunlight during the day, but after sunset, the glass would lose heat rapidly. Denise explained it simply. Glass lets sunlight in efficiently, but after the sun goes down, warm surfaces inside the greenhouse radiate heat outward. The colder the glass becomes, the faster the greenhouse loses warmth. But Claire had something most greenhouse growers didn't. The barn wall, the underground water, and 300 pieces of glass that could be arranged to create separate thermal zones. Claire began experimenting. During the day, she filled 55-gallon drums with water. At night, the drums released stored heat. She covered the north wall with salvaged insulation. She planted the cold-tolerant greens closest to the barn. The warmest crops went beneath the largest south-facing windows. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Then winter arrived early. On November 11th, a hard freeze hit Washington County. Temperatures fell to 17 degrees. Claire woke at 3:40 a.m. The greenhouse was dark. She ran outside. Frost covered the outside of every window. Inside, the lettuce was still standing. The water barrels were warm. But Claire noticed something disturbing. One entire row of seedlings had wilted. She touched the soil. Frozen. A cold pocket had formed beneath the western roof. The old windows were creating uneven temperatures. Claire had solved one problem and created another. She spent the next 3 days measuring temperature at 36 points inside the greenhouse. The pattern finally appeared. The smallest windows were leaking heat around their frames. The large panes were performing better. Claire didn't have enough money to replace the bad windows, so she did something nobody expected. She took them apart. She removed every rotten frame section. Then she rebuilt the weakest windows using wood from the collapsed machine shed. By December, all 300 windows had been sorted. 241 could be restored. 59 became spare glass, benches, cold frames, and replacement panes. Nothing was wasted, but the farm still wasn't profitable. The first winter harvest brought in only $8,700. The bank wanted $19,000. Claire needed another answer. Then Denise called. There's a chef in Cedar Rapids looking for local winter greens. How much? Enough to matter. Claire didn't ask questions. She loaded crates into her old Ford pickup. The first delivery sold out in 40 minutes. The second restaurant ordered twice as much. Then another called. Then another. By February, Claire was supplying 11 restaurants. But the biggest change came when a grocery buyer visited the farm. She walked into the greenhouse and stared at the old windows. You built this from salvaged glass? Claire nodded. The buyer tasted a handful of winter spinach. Then she asked one question. How much can you grow? Claire looked through the glass at the snow-covered orchard. She had no idea, but she knew the greenhouse was bigger than she had thought. And when she walked back to the farmhouse that evening, an envelope from the bank was waiting on the kitchen table. The foreclosure notice had arrived. Claire opened it. The deadline was 6 weeks away. Then her phone rang. It was the grocery buyer. I need £4,000 a month. Claire looked toward the greenhouse. She was producing less than a quarter of that. For the first time, the old windows weren't just a project. They were a promise she might not be able to keep. And outside, beneath the snow, the buried water line was still running. Claire pinned the grocery buyer's order above the kitchen table. For £1,000 a month. She stared at the number until the coffee beside her went cold. The greenhouse was producing barely £900. The foreclosure deadline was 6 weeks away. There was no money for expansion, no money for commercial heating, no money for a new greenhouse, and no time. At sunrise, Claire walked to the greenhouse with a notebook. The old windows surrounded her on every side. 300 pieces of discarded glass had become something almost nobody in Washington County believed could work. But almost wasn't enough. She needed 4 times the production. She stopped beside the western wall. The temperature there was 5 degrees colder than the center. Claire looked at the glass, then at the water barrels, then at the barn wall. Something wasn't being used correctly. She spent the next 2 days measuring sunlight. She marked where shadows fell at 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. The answer appeared slowly. The greenhouse wasn't too small. It was wasting sunlight. The old windows were arranged according to their sizes, not according to sun. Claire began taking them down. Harold arrived halfway through the dismantling. He stared at her. You're tearing it apart? Claire nodded. It isn't facing the light correctly. Harold looked at the windows. Those took you months. I know. You sure? Claire looked at the winter sun, reflecting off the glass. No. It was the first time Harold had heard uncertainty in her voice. But she kept working. For 3 weeks, Claire rebuilt the greenhouse around the movement of sunlight rather than the shape of the available lumber. The tallest windows became the southern wall. The smaller panes filled gaps along the eastern side. The cloudy glass went into the north-facing sections. The best panes were tilted slightly to catch low winter sunlight. The old barn became a thermal wall. The underground water line filled storage tanks during daylight. At night, those tanks slowly released heat. It was simple, but it changed everything. The greenhouse temperature stayed remarkably stable. Then Claire planted again. Not tomatoes, not peppers. She planted what the grocery buyer needed. Spinach, baby kale, arugula, lettuce, microgreens, radishes. The crops grew beneath the old windows while snow covered the orchard outside. For the first time, Claire could see the farm's future. But the bank didn't care about potential. On March 4th, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. A man in a gray coat stepped out. His name was Robert Kessler. He was the bank's agricultural loan officer. Claire knew him. He had visited twice before. Both times he had carried a folder. This time he carried 2. Robert walked into the greenhouse. He looked around. How much have you sold? Claire handed him the records. He studied them. 48,000? Gross. Net. 31. Robert nodded. That doesn't cover the note. I know. He looked at the windows. Claire, this is clever. But clever isn't the same as profitable. She said nothing. He closed the folder. The foreclosure process begins April 17th. Claire nodded. Robert hesitated. Then he pointed toward the greenhouse. If you can show me a contract covering the debt, I can request an extension. He left. Claire stood alone among the windows. A contract. That was what she needed. Not another experiment. Not another good harvest. A buyer willing to put the future in writing. The grocery buyer returned 3 days later. She walked through the greenhouse with a scale. She weighed the crops, checked the leaves, examined the roots. Then she asked Claire how much she could deliver. For 1,000 pounds. The buyer smiled. Every month. Claire hesitated. Yes. The buyer looked at the roof. You're promising a lot for a greenhouse made from old windows. Claire looked at the glass. They were strong enough to last 50 years. The buyer smiled. Fair answer. She signed the contract. Claire's hands trembled when she held it. The contract was worth $420,000 over the first 12 months. Not $500,000. But enough to stop the foreclosure. Enough to keep the farm. Enough to breathe. Then came the problem nobody expected. The greenhouse couldn't produce 4,000 pounds. Not yet. Claire had calculated the space, the soil, the crop rotation, the water. But she had forgotten one thing. Labor. For 1,000 pounds meant harvesting almost every morning. Washing, sorting, cooling, packing, delivering. She couldn't do it alone. For 2 weeks, Claire tried. She woke at 3:30, harvested until sunrise, loaded the Ford pickup, delivered to Cedar Rapids, returned, planted, watered, harvested again. On March 21st, she collapsed onto the barn floor. Harold found her there. He didn't ask what happened. He simply sat beside her. After a while, Claire said, I can't do all of it. Harold looked toward the greenhouse. No. Claire expected him to tell her to sell. Instead, he said, You never were supposed to. The next morning, Harold called 4 retired farmers. Then 2 high school agricultural students came. Then Denise brought 3 seasonal workers. Within a week, the greenhouse had become a small operation. But something else was changing. People who had laughed at the windows were now stopping by to look. A contractor who had mocked Claire brought her a truckload of discarded storm windows. A retired carpenter repaired frames for free. The grocery buyer increased the order. And Harold began telling everyone the same thing. Those aren't old windows anymore. They were becoming part of the farm. By late April, the greenhouse was producing nearly 3,800 pounds a month. Claire was close. Then a violent spring storm rolled across Washington County. The wind hit 62 miles per hour. Claire heard the first pane crack at 11:18 p.m. Then another. She ran outside. Rain struck sideways. The greenhouse shook. One of the eastern frames tore loose. Claire grabbed a rope. Harold arrived behind her. Together they fought the wind until midnight. But the storm kept coming. At 12:47, the largest southern window shattered. Then another. Claire froze. For months, those windows had been the heart of everything. Now pieces of them glittered across the wet soil. By morning, 37 panes were broken. The grocery delivery was due in 4 days. Claire walked through the wreckage. She didn't cry. She picked up one piece of glass. Then another, and noticed something. The plants directly beneath the broken windows were healthier than the plants beneath the intact ones. Claire stared at them. Rainwater had reached the soil. The plants had received more air, and the broken section had created a natural temperature release. She looked upward, then toward the roof. The greenhouse didn't need to be sealed. It needed to breathe. Claire spent the next 48 hours redesigning the damaged section. Instead of replacing every broken pane, she installed hinge ventilation panels using the remaining salvaged windows. During the day, they opened automatically with wax cylinder vent openers. At night, they closed. The greenhouse began regulating itself. Production increased. The crops grew faster. And by June, Claire had reached a number everyone had told her was impossible. for £1,000, then 4,300, then 4,700. But the biggest surprise came on the morning of July 2nd. Claire walked to the far end of the greenhouse. Sunlight poured through hundreds of mismatched panes. Some were clear, some were cloudy. Some carried tiny scratches from the houses they had once belonged to. Together, they turned the entire structure golden. 300 old windows stood around Claire like a patchwork history of Iowa. She could see the orchard through them. She could see the fields. She could see the old Farmel M resting beside the barn. And she could see something else. A handwritten sign hanging on the greenhouse door. Mercer Farm, winter and year-round greens. The same people who had laughed at the trailer now stood outside asking where they could buy her produce. Claire stepped back. For years, everyone had seen 300 unwanted windows. She had seen 300 chances to hold sunlight, and the greenhouse had finally become what she imagined the first night. Not a shelter from winter, a machine for turning winter into money. But when Claire calculated the year's projected revenue, she found a number that made her sit down. The grocery contract wasn't going to produce $500,000. It was going to produce more. And the old windows had only begun earning their keep. By September 2020, Claire stopped looking at the greenhouse as an experiment. It had become the center of the farm. Every morning began before sunrise. The Farmel M started on the second crank. Workers moved quietly between rows of spinach and lettuce. The old windows glowed with the first light. And beneath the greenhouse floor, the forgotten water system still carried cold spring water to the farm her grandfather had nearly lost. But Claire still had one number written on the kitchen wall, $500,000. She had not reached it. Not yet. The grocery contract had transformed the farm. But Claire had discovered something else. Restaurants didn't just want greens. They wanted consistency. Chefs wanted the same quality every week. The grocery buyer wanted the same weight every Tuesday. And customers were willing to pay more for something they could trace back to a specific farm. Claire began packaging the greens in small wooden crates. Every crate carried the Mercer Farm name. Nothing flashy, just a name. The story traveled. A food writer from Des Moines came to photograph the greenhouse. Then another buyer called. Then a restaurant group asked about winter herbs. Claire expanded carefully. She never borrowed money unless she knew exactly what would pay it back. The greenhouse grew, not by replacing the windows, by adding more structures around them. She used new materials where strength mattered. But every old window she could save found a place somewhere on the farm. A cold frame, a propagation house, a small herb room, even the farmhouse porch. The original 300 remained at the center. By November, the farm had crossed $500,000 in gross annual sales. Claire didn't celebrate with champagne. She stood in the greenhouse holding the old notebook from the first night. The pages were stained with soil. The first entry still read, 300 windows. Underneath it, she had written, "Find a way to make them useful." She closed the notebook. Then someone knocked on the greenhouse door. It was Robert Kessler, the banker. He looked different without his foreclosure folder. He walked slowly through the greenhouse. "I owe you an apology." Claire looked at him. "You don't?" "Yes, I do." He touched one of the restored frames. "I thought this was a desperate woman's last idea." Claire smiled faintly. "It was—" Robert laughed. Then his expression became serious. "You know what changed my mind?" Claire waited. "You didn't prove the greenhouse worked." He pointed toward the floor. "You proved the farm could work with what it already had." Claire looked down. The soil beneath her boots was dark and warm. Robert handed her a folder. She opened it. Her farm loan had been refinanced. Lower interest. Longer term. No foreclosure. Claire closed the folder. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was borrowing time. She was building it. The farm continued growing. By 2022, Mercer Farm employed 12 people during peak season. By 2024, the greenhouse system supplied restaurants and grocery stores throughout eastern Iowa, and the old windows became famous locally. People began bringing Claire their own: a demolished farmhouse, an abandoned schoolhouse, a church renovation, an old machine shop, Whenever someone had windows they didn't know what to do with, they called Claire. She never accepted everyone. She had learned that salvage only mattered when it had a purpose. Harold kept the Farm-LM running. He replaced the carburetor once, the radiator another time, but he refused to repaint it. Let it look old, he told Claire. Why? So people know it kept working. Claire understood. 5 years after the first trailer arrived, Harold brought her to the original greenhouse wall. The 300 windows were still there. Some had been replaced with identical salvage panes. Others still carried their old imperfections. Claire could recognize several immediately. One had a tiny blue streak in the glass. Another had a brass latch. One had a crack sealed with clear resin. They had become markers of time. Then Claire noticed something else. The southernmost window had a small wooden frame around it. Inside was a photograph. Her grandfather stood beside the orchard in 1974. The spring house was behind him. Claire had never seen the photograph before. Harold had found it in an old toolbox. On the back, her grandfather had written, "Water first. Everything else follows." Claire read it twice, then looked toward the buried pipe. The old man had known. The greenhouse had never really been about windows. The windows captured sunlight. The water held the heat. The barn protected the north side. The soil stored warmth. The crops transformed all of it into something people needed. Nature had been doing most of the work. Claire had simply learned how to listen. That became the lesson she taught younger farmers who visited. Not every old thing was valuable. Not every broken thing was useless. And not every farm needed to become bigger. Sometimes it needed to become smarter. The county contractor, who had laughed at the original trailer, eventually retired. Before leaving, he visited the farm. He stood outside the greenhouse for several minutes. Then he said, "I was wrong." Claire nodded. He looked at the windows. "How did you know?" Claire shook her head. "I didn't." He seemed surprised. Claire continued, "I just kept looking." That was the truth. She hadn't known the greenhouse would work. She hadn't known the buried water line would matter. She hadn't known the grocery buyer would sign the contract. She hadn't known a storm would destroy 37 panes and accidentally teach her how to ventilate the greenhouse. Every answer had come from paying attention to the thing nobody else considered important. The old windows, the cold water, the tired soil, the wind, the shadows, the farm itself. A decade after Claire loaded those 300 windows onto the trailer, Mercer Farm had become one of Washington County's better-known small agricultural operations. The greenhouse had earned well beyond the original $500,000 milestone. The old Farm-LM still worked. Harold still complained about modern equipment. Denise still visited twice each season. Robert Kessler eventually became a friend of the family. And Claire's greenhouse became a place where young farmers came to learn. But Claire kept one window separate from the others. It hung above the farmhouse kitchen table. The glass was cloudy. The wooden frame was scarred. A bee had once crawled beneath it. Claire never repaired the glass. She wanted to remember exactly what it looked like when everyone else called it worthless. One autumn evening, Claire walked out after the workers had gone home. The greenhouse was quiet. The sun was dropping behind the orchard. 300 windows caught the fading light. Some reflected the sky. Others reflected the apple trees. A few reflected Claire herself as she moved between the rows. She stopped beside the old water line. The buried pipe was still running. Quietly, constantly, the same water that had flowed beneath the farm before she was born. She thought about the first night, the foreclosure notice, the empty bank account, the laughter, the broken windows, the storm, the first harvest, and the number that once seemed impossible, $500,000. She realized then that the money had never been the strangest part. The strangest part was that the farm had been trying to tell her what it needed all along. The old trees, the underground water, the southern light, the discarded windows. She only had to stop trying to make the farm behave like someone else's farm. Claire turned off the greenhouse lights. Outside, the last sunlight slipped across the glass. The Farm-LM sat beside the barn. The orchard moved gently in the evening wind. And inside the greenhouse, the 300 old windows held the final warmth of the day. Claire closed the door. She didn't lock it. She never did. Because tomorrow morning, before sunrise, someone would need to come in and harvest what the farm had learned to grow. And when morning came, mist settled between the apple trees. The first light touched the old windows. The greenhouse glowed softly against the sleeping fields. Then the Farm M started on one crank. If you grew up around a farm, an old farmhouse, or a piece of equipment that your family refused to throw away, you probably understand why Claire kept those windows. Sometimes the things that look useless are the things that carry the most history. Tell us about the old machine, building, tool, field, or family farming tradition you still remember. Your story might inspire someone else's. And if you enjoyed Claire's story, stay close to the next one, because another forgotten piece of American farm history is about to become something nobody expected.